وانفجار ثاني وانفجارات كبيرة وهائلة، وربما هذا ما أشار له المسؤولون العسكريون.
The United States is in a state of security and surprise.
We fear this. We fear that they have something out that the majority of the people don't know about.
Olan tüm halkların hakları gibi haklar. Ne aşağı ne yukarı. Ne fazla ne az.
Pent-up feelings that may result from decades of repression and people who've had members of their family killed by that regime.
A lot of killers. Get a lot of killers. Why you think our country's so innocent?
But I won't attack it because someone sicks me on. I don't let anybody use me to fight their battles.
Hello and welcome to Varn Blog, and today we're talking to Jared, the cyber dandy, and we are talking about American anti-communism through, well, the entire history of the United States. My period of specialization in American anti-communism is 1890 through about 1940, which is why when everyone's talking about the first and second Red Scares, I'm always like renumbering them. I'm like, you mean the fourth and fifth Red Scares? Because there was like three more before that. You just don't remember. Honestly, you could really start talking about Red Scares going all the way back to the period right after Reconstruction. And if you want to be really, really expansive, you can talk about bourgeois scares of egalitarianism going all the way back to the Whig sphere of egalitarian supremacy. As I always tell people when they read Madison, the minority that he's explicitly talking about isn't racial and ethnic minorities, it's the rich, and he says so like straight up. And I know this would confound many liberals in my audience. I don't know how many liberals are still in my audience these days, but that I've actually pointed out that like there is a truth that the constitutionalists and federalists revolution really was a counter-revolution, and that the anti-federalists who we think of as reactionaries, and like in some modern sense they were, but they were also in league with people who were far more egalitarian in their outlook than the Federalists were, and the Constitutionalists were. So, Patrick Henry becomes a libertarian icon, but this is really before the left-right split is really clear in the United States. So, I mean, it's the same reason why Tom Paine ends up being both a communist and a reactionary figure in modern iconography. Like Glenn Beck appeals to him all the time, but so do communists, and rightfully, actually, in both cases. Although I think the reactionaries have to ignore everything he wrote about France and everything he wrote about religion and everything, but still, he does have an anti-government orientation that can speak to a lot of modern conservative reactionaryism. And I don't say that because I think government is good either. I'm just saying that in the American parlance now, that's where it tends to go. So that's a lot of me doing this 180 degrees, 300 feet up view of American history here. Where would you start when we talk about anti-communism in America?
Yeah, I would start all the way at the beginning, where you said with the so already in like 1798, there were, well, first of all, there was all of those experimental, utopian communist projects like the Owenites, the Communist League, Oneida or whatever it was called.
Oneida, the Transcendentalists are tied up into it. Who else is in it? There's there's several transcendentalist farm communes that start up in like the 1820s and 1830s. Not Fabianism. God, what is that French name?
Yeah.
Fourierism. Yeah.
Yeah.
Fourierism is super common in the United States before
Right.
1860.
The phalanxes.
Right. I mean, they're all over the place, actually.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. I just want to drop a book. There's actually a conservative history of American leftism that writes positively about the phalanxes and Fourierism.
Wow.
Which is really weird, but nevertheless.
Well, so yeah, so I mean that's one reason already to start there is because that's also, you know, the beginnings of communistic or socialistic projects in the United States, but also the Federalists really freaked the fuck out about the French Terror, and they see the early radicals, like you said, as being like political radicals, as being egalitarian and conflicting with the ideals of republicanism. And so, right from the beginning of the formation of the federal government and all of that, you already have this really strong push for consolidating Republican values. And you already start seeing like the Naturalization, Sedition, and Alien Acts being passed, which are already looking at anything that divides society along class lines as something imported and foreign and objectionable on the basis of revolution, individualism.
I mean, you basically have this turn in America. I mean, the United States is so interesting compared to the European bourgeois traditions because it's a revolution that gets rid of its aristocracy by just cutting ties. The aristocracy doesn't really go away in any of the local aristocratic powers. Don't they just become the planter class in the South but the formal aristocracy is easy to get rid of because it's not here in the first place. They didn't send it to the colonies for the most part.
Right. Yeah.
And what little it did went to Canada immediately to retain its rights. So they didn't have to it was a civil war. I mean, the American Revolution was a civil war. People should not downplay that. And in fact, people forget or probably just don't know that the South was actually the most loyal to the crown because it had the most aristocratic backing, and at the time was the least religious part of the country, which I know blows people's mind.
Well, and then to add to that, you also have the Anglicans, right? Who wanted to maintain their loyalties because they're part of the Anglican tradition.
Yeah, so you have a whole religious order that knows if they break with England, they're going to lose all their privileges. And you do have the fact that while most of the orders in the United States are like the Methodists are split off from the Anglicans, the most of the early semi-egalitarian, semi-communist, I know people are going to go nuts when I say this, but the Puritans were kind of communistic.
As far as their property values, yes.
Right.
But like their gender stuff and among other things was very much not.
Right. Well, but I will say this, the gender question, even amongst communists, was not really concluded until like the 20th century.
Well, yeah, even among anarchists, Proudhon was a famous sexist. I mean, he wrote on the importance of marriage.
I mean, I think about I can even think about female socialists who fought against giving women the vote, like Edith Nesbit.
Yes.
I mean,
and just actually, we should probably mention voting in general because if we're talking about this period, the franchise wasn't extended to most people anyway. We're talking about when the vote was still the propertied class.
Right. And people will notice there's no amendment that totally get. I mean, I guess maybe does the 13th and 14th technically get rid of property restrict? I think what more or less happens is it's forced down by state to state level reforms actually that get rid of that, and that's why they could impose it again later, but for racial reasons during post Reconstruction.
Yeah, and we're gonna come back to that federal versus state thing for sure, because that plays a big role in like early anti-communist how it unfolded, right? Yeah, so right from the beginning, anti-radicalism basically, was targeting communists as well as just political radicals that were seen as too French or what have you. But then eventually you have the Paris Commune, and America is industrializing more, right? And that's going to usher in a very different circumstance for both labor in general and the way that anti-communism starts unfolding in the urban centers.
Right. I think people also need to remember, because this period of American history is always kind of skipped over. What happens is you get told Civil War, Gilded Age, but we're not talking about it. Wilson, FDR, Teddy Roosevelt, Wilson, FDR, conservative and liberal progressivism manifest. Great Depression happens. Either the New Deal or the war saves you, depending on what side of the political debate you're on, neither of which is actually totally true, I may add. Although I would actually say, as a Marxist, I think the war did more than progressivism. But not for the reasons conservatives think. 1950s go, and they don't look at this entire time period from like 1866 to like 1890, or really to like 1910. All right.
Yeah, which is like kind of like when the clay is starting to harden.
Right. I mean, that is when. So one thing that I think people don't understand is American national identity doesn't really, as a unified national project, does not really exist until the Civil War. It's not really there. So what I mean by that, there's literally if you go back and read historical documents, there's literally a point shortly after the Civil War where we start referring to these United States of America, us, plural, the way that people in the European Union still refer to themselves, to a singular polity being spoken about, and it is after the Civil War.
Right. And something that should be clarified too is like when I say Republican values or republicanism, I'm not talking about at the federal level.
Mm-hmm.
Republicanism was imagined back then at the state level. Right. And I was even reading a book recently about like how long theocratic rule lasted in the United States. And even like
that's also till the Civil War.
Yeah.
I mean, people don't know that because until the 13th and 14th, the 12th and 13th or 13th and 14th amendment, it's the 13th, which expands the Bill of Rights to states. It actually enforces the supremacy clause onto the states. Before then, a state could have a state church. That didn't end with the American Revolution.
Right. And yeah, exactly. And the state could limit freedom of speech.
Mm-hmm.
I think that was argued, the federal government can't do it, but I think who was that? Jefferson was still fine with states doing it.
Right.
And so republicanism, like we want to imagine the federal government is kind of being what the United States is, but for conservatives, I don't think that's true. And I think you can draw.
I don't think it's true for anybody before Abraham Lincoln either. So,
yeah. We're talking about before they were conservatives and it was still fresh. But
I mean, I think I think it's also hard to grasp this too, because the Democrat Republicans, which is Jefferson's party. And we always talk about it as the foundation. I mean, it's interesting that like you have to point out that Jefferson is the foundation of the Democrats, and the Democrats. I think the Democratic Party is the oldest existing voter base party on the planet. Now that's interesting. That's a really interesting technicality. There are older technical parties in Britain, but those parties are parliamentary and formal parties. They are basically informal factions. And our parties kind of start off that way. I mean, the Whigs are kind of that, actually. And the Democrat Republicans are kind of a formal movement. And it's very hard when we talk about like the myths of the founding fathers and stuff. And I really wish leftists and communists would actually study this more. I know that American history seems boring and unsexy, but the way we're taught it in school is really misleading.
Mhm.
That the Whigs seem progressive on some issues because they're they're for bourgeois efficiency. You can think about Hamilton, but you can really think about someone like John Quincy Adams, right? Not John Adams so much, but John Quincy Adams seems progressive because their stances on slavery, their stances on free labor, their pushes for relative enfranchisement. You even read someone like John Adams, who is relatively gender egalitarian for the time. He's not really gender egalitarian, but compared to Jefferson or Washington or that he's also anti-slavery before it's cool, but he's actually profoundly a reactionary in the U.S. context, pushing the Alien Sedition Acts. He's not totally uncomfortable with getting rid of the monarchy. He's one of the big pushes for like the unitary executive and the monarchical executive. You know, and people like ask me about the Constitution, and I'm like, well, the funny thing is, like, the Supreme Court gave judicial review to itself, and also the first laws that were really pushed by Congress were in blatant violation of the Constitution, and no one said shit about it. Like, I mean, the Alien and Sedition Acts are clearly unconstitutional, and it's not like the Supreme Court gets rid of them immediately.
Well, and that right, exactly. yeah. There is a lot to unpack in this time period, and we could go on and on about it.
Right. But I think we do need to get to the Civil War to really start understanding things, because I think there's a tendency also that leftists have to like occasionally. The old CPUSA used to do this during their social patriotism period. The DSA does it when it's trying its right opportunist strategy, as opposed to its left opportunist one, where they go back and read like early American history through pink colored glasses, which I think is nuts, because you just can't really find, like, there are egalitarian movements in the United States. There are proto-communist movements in the United States. They're actually pretty common. They tend to be slightly religious or utopian, and they don't get violently crushed. They just get marginalized in most cases, which does put them in somewhat better. Like it's part of why you don't hear them, because no one went in and like militarily wiped out UNITA like they did the Paris Commune.
Right.
But there are exceptions to that, and there are exceptions that people will sometimes, like, you will hear liberals try to portray, say, the Whiskey Rebellion as a proto-conservative movement in 1780 or whatever. And I'm like, that's ridiculous. But
what of Porsche's rebellion?
Yeah.
Which is, what the fuck, if you need evidence of like what America has been about since the beginning as a federal government, that's...
Oh yeah. So you have the Whiskey Rebellion, you have Shays Rebellion. They're both put down brutally.
Yeah.
And also a lot of the liberal heroes, like say Hamilton, want to be more brutal than the US even is.
Yes.
Like I think Hamilton basically wanted to hang everybody. And Washington was like, no, that'll breed reaction, you moron. Because Washington's a pragmatist. I mean, wasn't even particularly good general. I know that's probably not fun to say, but it's true. But he was a pragmatist, and he knew you couldn't get away with like hanging most of the community. But it is, that's the early history there. And I think it's interesting that if you look at when the Paris Commune happens, it's actually in the context of our Civil War.
Yeah.
And our Civil War is also misunderstood by leftists as being a unilaterally progressive thing on the North's part, where it's not really. This is a bourgeois versus a aristocratic bourgeois, which is hard to explain because even Marxists surprised that there has been a form of slavery that can exist within capitalism and be capitalistic because it doesn't fit with his modes of production. But he does admit, I mean, I used to go back and forth from this myself, and I've kind of come around to the idea that slavery was a kind of was a throwback, but it was a throwback within capitalism. You can't say it's a separate thing, even though some of the slavers thought it was. The book, so I've talked about the book Sociology for the South, which is totally weird because one of the first guys to use socialist uses it and to fight capitalism uses it to promote a slave society and to keep most people from being enfranchised. It's really strange. And it's such like it's like socialism, but as told to you by some bizarre aristocratic nightmare land, where most people are relieved of not just the burden of the vote, but the burden of freedom at all. Because no one can exploit you if you don't have free labor.
Makes sense.
Right. So just stay and be dominated so no one can exploit you. And serve your betters, and he wasn't just talking about in fact, he went so far as to say that maybe the North would be more productive if it enslaved certain kinds of white people, as opposed to just limiting slavery to the quote, to like the lesser races in his mind. He's like, well, we need to maybe deal with the lesser whites too and enslave them as well.
Oh man, I need to check this out.
it's a mad, crazy book. It's called Sociology for the South. I did a review of it on Swampside Chats once. But that's the world of in which this is happening. And you also have the fact that as federal policy, when northern expansion fails, because northern expansion and actually even early westward expansion is posited as liberation of a colonial oppression. All right. Mm-hmm. So the settlers will throw off the yoke of Europe. This is also where the Monroe Doctrine comes from. We're going to liberate Canada. They try that first. That horribly backfires. The British burned down the White House, and we have a stalemate with the UK, and we basically go, okay, we're not going to try to liberate Nova Scotia and Ontario again.
Yeah.
We bought New France, so we don't need to liberate that. We just bought it. Was it theirs to sell? I don't care. One of my favorite things about all those like Mexico maps is they actually include a lot of the Louisiana Purchase territory in that old Mexico because it was contested because no one had actually settled the ownership, and like that's part of why Napoleon sold it to us for so cheap. It's like he was tired of fighting the Spanish for it. And so all this happens, and then the last bit we just conclude to just take from Mexico, but originally it's posited as taking from Spain, which is a much easier sell.
Yeah, the imperial competition in the whole continent was extreme, right? I mean,
and all these states are settler colonial states too, which is also I think something a lot of leftists miss. Like Mexico is not a settler colonial state, like.
Right. Yeah. Right. Of course.
So all this is happening, and there's in this turmoil, though, there's a lot of weird communistic experiments kind of going on, particularly in the frontiers, and no one gives a shit because it's in the frontiers. Like, and
Right.
and it really is kind of a Malthusian way of getting rid of the East Coast's excess population. Like just throw them out there. If they survive, we settled it. If they don't survive, they're not a problem.
There was some government encouragement of that kind of settler.
That was totally government encouraged.
Yeah.
But the government didn't go out there and build infrastructure for them. They just said, we're giving you this land.
Yeah.
If you can make something of it, you can have it. Have a good day.
But
you may or may not establish a government.
And it also was a haven for whoever was criminalized or so on and so forth.
And that's true up until the early 20th century, even. Like, that's true even in the Great Depression. Like, you could hop on a train and go to the Midwest, and like, it's going to be a long time for anyone can enforce a New York warrant on you in California. Like, good fucking luck. Like, so yeah, that all happens. And I think people also forget that's a really long part of American history. That's like the first 110 years or more.
And we're going all the way, we're basically saying before World War One, right?
Mm-hmm.
So even before World War One, you already had the United States, the Working Men's Party of the United States became the Socialist Labor Party.
Mm-hmm.
And you had the Haymarket Affair, that the assassination attempt on Frick, the big industrialist guy who, I forget there was like a huge problem with Frick, and the anarchist Alexander Berkman tried to kill him, didn't work, and then the whole Union project, almost as a result of that attempt, broke apart. Anyway, and then the McKinley assassination. This is all.
It's either all anarchist or blamed on anarchist.
Yes, it was, and and that's I'm an anarchist. If your audience didn't know that already, so I get my panties in a bunch when the Red Scare. People on the left tend to forget how much of that impacted anarchists as well.
I mean, I will say, like, radical liberals, anarchists, and communists in the United States in particular, but even in Europe, are not really, even left nationalists, let's be honest, are not really separated out.
No, they were
until
all
the 20th century. They don't really even see each other as separate movements.
No, they're all part of the First International. Even even the nationalists were.
I mean, the national and right. And actually, it's weird because you can't predict who the nationalists are going to side with, because in like Italy, they side with the anarchists. And I know we're not talking about like European history now, but the basis of Italian Marxism actually is the nationalists collating with the anarchists and them getting frustrated with Italian anarchists. So they go back to being Marxist, but their own weird form of it. Like which is wild to me. I mean, it's like the history of communism in China. You're just like, what? There's so many anarchists in that. Like, it's like there really isn't a distinction until there's made to be one.
Yeah, and the opponents also didn't make the distinction. The anti-communists, or who, they didn't make the distinction. They
barely distinguished radical liberals from them. Like, and so like, if you hear the, left communists are post-leftist who are very different people, but they both use the phrase left of capital. But I'm like, these anti-communists are throwing in such a wide net that they're also going after their progressive, the progressive capitalists, who themselves are also in many ways diehard anti-communists.
Yeah, but at least from what I've been studying, most of the anti-communist stuff was not directed at the political parties until way later, until basically the Bolshevik Revolution.
Yeah. No. They went after individuals and cultures. They thought they could keep the political parties under control, I think. Well, although the populists were actually the bigger scare to them than either the Socialist Labor Party or the Socialist Party. Like, because the populists would occasionally take state houses. So,
yeah. But I mean, okay, you know the NAM,
Mhm.
okay, so that well, this is sort of next period. Anyway, you had all of that radical stuff going on in Chicago and everything in this period, all before World War One even happened, right?
Mhm.
And um, the way that the federal government's powers were limited at that time meant that really the federal government couldn't do much as to its own citizens, or at least to, yeah. So the way that anti-communism functioned was they would deport as many people as possible. And the ones that they couldn't deport, vigilante groups dealt with them, and patriot organizations led by business people and the NAM and things like that.
Wait, so you have the privatization of security doing a lot of the actual work. So, I mean, I think people are a little bit more familiar with this in the early 20th century with like the Pinkertons
Yeah, yeah,
and the Baldwin men going in and killing off all the mine strikers and all this,
yeah.
who also like are in conditions that one cannot even say are proletarian. They're basically serfs. Like, and I know people like, what? I'm like, no, they were contract bound to enclosed economies, to these companies.
But they were a lot of them were wobblies too, right?
Right.
The IWW in this period is one of the big threats to capital. Still a small one, but
A tiny one, but yes. um,
but
it was
they're
huge at the
yeah,
time.
they were going after the Socialist Party and the IWW for the most part.
And they're afraid of the populist too, actually. But the populist, I think Christopher Lash's early work is really good on this. That he describes how the populist, in the United States, do what the Bolsheviks or the early Bolsheviks do, which is unite what are effectively peasants, and this by we mean sharecroppers and farm workers, and up with laborers. So they're allies to the Socialist Party. There's a lot of petit bourgeois in them from a Marxist perspective, but these are people. But these are also people who more or less do not own that much. They don't really own their means of production. A lot of them are sharecroppers. So when I say there's a lot of petit bourgeois in them, there is a lot of petit bourgeois in them, but they're mostly like the overwhelming. I think the majority of the party is sharecroppers. They win a lot of elections in the Midwest and the Upper South, particularly in places like Kansas. And when the Republican and they ally often with the Republicans because the Democrats are an even more reactionary party at this time. I mean, we're still talking about the Democrats of the Civil War,
Right.
and thereafter. But the Republicans keep screwing them, and there's many times where they try to break in and take their seats in state houses with guns. Like that happens more than once.
This history, yeah, I'm not familiar with that.
Right. So, the thing is, I'm learning is American history is one of the, particularly the history of the American left, is the best kept secret the American left does not know anything about until fucking 1960. Or at best, they know about 30s and 40s CPUSA, and their understanding of it is selective, like from the historic period when the IWW stops to fade and the CP steps in the South.
Yeah, and that's way down the road from where
Right.
we're even
Yeah, we're
talking.
nowhere near that. Like we are in the 1890s, and I think also people don't know is between 1870 and 1910, there are 4 depressions that are technically worse than the Great Depression, and in those depressions, capital suffers not at all. That's why we call it the Gilded Age. It wasn't that what we saw was everyone got poorer. It really was a rich get richer, poor get immensely poor. And this is also happening in Europe. This is why that a lot of Marxists and a lot of anarchists believe in the immiseration thesis, because they're like, there's no way this can keep going this way and society just not fall apart in our favor. So that's all happening, right? And they want to suppress this shit. They want to suppress, and there's 3 ways that they can do it. racial division works really fucking well because it provides, it turns labor against itself over and over and over again. And it's one of those things that, I think W.E.B. Du Bois, it wasn't in The Souls of Black Folks, I think it was in the speech where he talks about why Southern white laborers get so racist is because they legitimately see Black people as a threat to what little stability they have left, because Black people are not incorporated into their unions. They can always be used as a scab labor force, or as a way to suppress wages or whatever. And Du Bois says, yeah, it's very useful for the ruling class to play, to play anti-racist every now and then to come and break Black workers in, because it also alienates the ability for these workers to unionize. And like Carnegie did it all the time. Like he was like, oh, I'm going to break these, these strikers, these particularly immigrant Manx and Cornish strikers, and then later on Italians. And I'm going to do that by bringing in the first Black labor force from the South to come in and take their jobs. And not only will I look good in the press for doing this, in the liberal press, I will totally break this union, and I will drive the Cornish and Manx into identifying with white people, which they really didn't do before that point. And if anyone studied the history of the Irish and the Italians, once you drive, once you make if you do something that posits a liminal, like an off-white category, they will be more reactionary to get the status.
Yes.
Like that, you can see it over and over again. Who are some of the most virulent racists in the United States? The Irish.
Right.
Why? Because they were trying to prove that they could belong.
Well, and police, right?
Yeah.
The history of Irish police is pretty.
Well, I mean, I think people also need to look at what policing is normally done. They don't take good wasps and turn them into police. You don't build your imperial army off of good British gentlemen. You go and use the fucking Scottish, who I will actually say this happened in the States too. After the Civil War, who did we try to make into the most loyal officer corps? Where did we put all the military barracks, etc.? In the South, right?
Let's deviate just for a second off the anti-communist thing and talk about the early police. The big thing I hear on the left all the time is that the police came out of slave catching.
They did in the South, but that's not their origins. I think the first police in the planet are the Irish Constabulary, who are established when the British military has to leave to fight another war. So they empower a bunch of Scotch-Irish locals and a bunch of Irish turncoats to enforce imperial will for them. That's the first police force. Everything else is traditionally done by a sheriff. And while now there's really no distinction between police and sheriff, traditionally sheriff is an elected and temporary position.
Yeah.
And it's recallable. Now its deep origins are in medieval feudal tax collection, but it was an elected position, whereas police are not. They're professionalized on purpose.
Yeah. And right. So yeah, I just sort of wanted to poke at that kind of simplification on the origin of police.
No, I think the police force in the North comes out of property protection rackets. Yeah. And it happens concurrently to the slave catchers. And it wasn't like the slave catching units weren't done by the state governments to just go, oh, we're going to take these slave catchers and just turn them into police so we can oppress Black people. It was, well, these are the people who have training in using violence. They also tended to not be planters or upper class. And so they had knowledge of lower class people. And so they're the natural people to hire. but it isn't a one-to-one extension. And policing comes out of British imperial policy, and Americans adopt it. And you still have a tension in jurisdictions because of this, that it's kind of residual, even though there's really no difference between sheriff departments and police departments and county and municipal, like, police enforcement anymore. But there is a tension there, because county sheriffs in most places are still elected.
Well, yeah, and I'm in Arizona, which
doesn't mean they're not super reactionary, but
Sheriff Joe and all that shit,
mm-hmm.
It's definitely been a hot topic for a long time. So.
But police are professionalized.
Yes.
But if you look at who the police attract, they almost always pull from the class of people they're policing. It is a way to get buy-in, right? You don't.
It's also cheaper.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, and I think, that's created some really weird class confusions. Like, I've had Marxists who, like, not now, but even someone like Pasolini, like in Italy, who would know better, would be like, well, I side with the police over the students because the police come from the working class. And in a sense of origins, he's kind of right, but, like, they're class traders. Like, almost that's their function. That's what they serve to do. And it's based off of the whole model is if
actually, you know what's interesting just on that point is one of the big Red Scare freakouts was when the police union went on strike. Is one of the tipping points for the bourgeoisie is they started freaking out because the police actually went on strike for once.
Right.
I forget when this was, but it was sort of one of the first Red Scare flare-ups. Let me look that up real quick.
Yeah. Let's see. Police Bank of 1919.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, they sought trade union recognition and improvement for working conditions in Boston.
Yep.
And they were seen as sympathetic to radicals for unionizing. People also forget that, like, unionization was semi-illegal for a long time.
Yeah, so that is so we're right at the origins of progressivism as well, right? Or the progressive movement, which pretty explicitly sought to co-opt everything to the left of it by offering, an amelioration strategy.
The idea, it comes even from, I try to point out, I think Christopher Lasch in his early 3 books, actually his 4 books, The American Reaction to the Russian Revolution, The Agony of the American Left, The World of Nations, and New American Radicals, history from 1780 to 1960, or New Radicalism in America, excuse me, not New American Radicals. These books cover that time period, and what is interesting is there's a reason why it comes initially out of the Republican Party. Actually, it comes out of a Brahmin class movement, and Lasch implies that actually conservatives may be right, that if World War II had not gone the way it had gone, that this movement would have sought to be an integralist corporatist movement, i.e., it would have developed not the same as fascism, but convergent upon it. Like, it would have gone in the same direction. The whole FDR talking about how great it is that Mussolini makes a train run on time, that sort of thing. Like, and that's because it ties in a lot of ideas that even socialists believed back then. Like, eugenics was a cross the board belief.
And there's anarchist eugenics. It really was across the board. It was.
It was wild how even there was anti-racist eugenics, like,
Yeah, I
which
mean
is
the
wild to talk about. But yeah,
but it was accepted as official scientific consensus as well. It's not like it was on the fringe.
right,
It was taught, really.
right, yeah, it was. And unfortunately, this is where things get muddy. You wanted to talk about you talked me off here. You want to talk about religion's response to this? Well, in America, Protestant religiosity is the vanguard of anti-communism, but it is also the place where black radicals and progressive radicals, particularly in the South and Midwest, actually can function, which leads it to be a very weird and contested territory.
Yeah.
Because like William Jennings Bryant, for example, like his argument at the Scots Monkey trial is all based on, like, people forget he's the guy who Scopes is fighting. It's William, it's the progressive icon, cross of don't sacrifice the working class on a cross of gold. William Jennings Bryant, fighting, fighting Clarence Darrow, who is a pretty reactionary lawyer on evolution. And one of the things that Jennings is worried about is eugenics being applied to poor white people, and he is pulling from biblical egalitarianism. And I wouldn't say he's an anti-racist, but for the South, he was an anti-racist. And that's a minority opinion. Like, but immediately, because leftists in Europe are also interested in evolution, this same force with some of the same people start being used to fight godless anarchism and communism.
Okay, so yeah, let's get into that, because right, exactly what you said, that it's really muddy as far as where Protestants are going to fall, and Catholics even.
Mm-hmm. It's still muddy on Catholics.
Yeah. So. But yes. But what happened was that socialists and communists and anarchists almost discredit themselves as potentially non-atheists, right? Like they almost self-exclude, and especially overseas. So I mean, and this goes back. So the reason I wanted to like really go over religion somewhat heavily in this history is because right from the beginning, with the anti-political radicalism, religion is playing its role, Christianity specifically, as providing a framework for fear of radicalism and egalitarianism, as being atheistic or anti-clerical, right? The anti-clerical.
Yeah, I think the anti-clerical is even, I mean, and we need to put that in context too, because when we're talking about abroad, we have to remember stuff like even the liberal faction of the Mexican Civil War on the on the Cristero War, which is where like the government, and we're not just talking about like the radical factions like the Zapatistas are
the Magonists.
We're talking are the Magonists or Pancho Villist or whatever. Yeah. We're talking about like Obrador, and in that group, it actually backfires in Mexico too, because they go so far they alienate the indigenous who feel protected by some of the priests, but they literally go through and hang all the priests from the light post,
right?
Like, and so, and Americans are getting this in the news, like in the 19 teens, like it's coming, like it's not just coming from Europe, they also see it to the South.
Yeah,
they freak out,
right? Like if you lived through 9/11 and you saw what patriotism did then, imagine that like times a million. Like with like, especially with like the Paris Commune, or like eventually the Bolshevik Revolution.
Or the Spanish Civil War.
Right.
I think we underestimate in the American mindset the Mexican Revolution, which we knew probably more about. Like,
Yeah.
Which is happening at the exact same time as the Russian Revolution. So,
and Haiti as well, by the way. Hey,
and there's been the whole like, we can't let those devil worshipping voodooist black people come up from Haiti and start spreading their weird egalitarian bullshit. I mean, so the United States is freaking. That's another point that ties us into the racial stuff. But it sort of decides where the Protestants are going to go, because even though they also hate priests, they realize that can be extended to them. And so, and I think one of the, it is an interesting, almost dialectical irony that in the United States, that even after the abolishment of state religions, and in fact, some people would say because of the abolishment of state religions after the Civil War, religiosity actually dramatically increases in the U.S. Like there's the first Great Awakening, it's the second Great Awakening, but there's a shit ton of revival stuff right after the Civil War. Like, it's huge. And it's hard to explain to people, like, the South was the less religious part of the United States in the beginning. That just, I think that blows everybody's mind. And it leads to some interesting problems even during this time period, because, like, if you're a black person, particularly after Reconstruction's more or less crushed in the 1890s, 1880s, 1890s, in that time period, your one safe place to organize is through the church.
Yeah.
But and those churches are entirely separate from the white church. The exception being the Catholic Church, but everybody else is like, it's really strange. Like, the towns where I grew up in, there's like a black Methodist church and a white Methodist church. There's a
when I go to
Baptist
the
church
South,
and a white
it's exactly like that. It's so interesting.
And I remember like the progressive. This is in the 90s. The progressive churches, like some of the Baptist churches who would leave the Southern Baptist Convention later, being like we can go and like worship with black people, and this being slightly controversial in the 90s.
Well, you got to remember, in the 90s is also when the Mormon doctrine changed to say that, black skin wasn't the sign of.
It's officially in the 70s, although there are still people who hold on to it. But yeah, but like, you couldn't go to BYU if you were black until I think the 80s. And that's because the federal government kind of forced them. And that was even after the prophet had a revelation that, like, you didn't have to be white and delisum anymore to get the priesthood. That was a metaphor, which, so yeah, that's true out west too. As a side note, I talk about this sometimes, that like the white people out here in the West are whiter than the white people in the South.
Mm-hmm.
Because all the white people in the South, as racist as a lot of us are, we're all secretly miscegenated. we just look different. And we don't look like Scotch Irish people entirely, which is what we're technically most of us supposed to be. So it is interesting to come out here and realize how separated some of these groups were. So religion and Mormon, like the Mormon privatized welfare model was a model used to argue that neoliberal welfare programs were possible. Like, They used Utah,
Interesting.
which leads to some crazy shit like donations to the church or tax encouragements to the church can be used to count for federal aid disbursement and stuff. Like, it's bizarre. So you had that out here. Again, it's also interesting, I think Lash writes about this. Early Mormons were racist, but other than that, they were radically egalitarian except for the prophet. Like, everybody was equal except for the prophet and the quorum. That ends pretty quickly. But what's funny is, like, they literally tried experiments in communism, like which they don't talk about anymore. But like, they tried to abolish money at one point. They tried total communal ownership. Like, it didn't work for a variety of reasons that I could go into in another day. But they tried it.
Well, which actually doesn't surprise me, because, like I said, I think the left sort of cut its own throat by highlighting its atheism,
right? As opposed to just being like, we're going to be neutral about it, and we secretly think it's going to go away anyway. Which is what, ironically, European progressives adopted, and it more or less kind of worked. So, yeah, and I think the biggest tell on this is actually, again, it's Russia itself. Like if you look at where the USSR and the Warsaw Pact had the lightest hand on religion, except for Poland, which is kind of unique, but which is like the Czech Republic and Slovenia, those are still the least religious places in like Europe. If you look at the places where religious oppression was the heaviest, I think people overstate the religious bounce back after 92. People have told me that's, from Russia, is like, yeah, people are pretty secular here, even if they claim to be Russian Orthodox. But the church was resurgent there. And I had a theory that, French laicism and the active suppression of religion, as opposed to just like, we're not going to give a shit about it, it has been the problem. Like, the cleric, like, to get rid of clergy, usually the best thing to do is just not make them get their pay from taxes. Like, and I have often argued that, if in America, if we wanted to hurt the clergy, we don't need to suppress them. We just need to get rid of most religious tax exemptions. Like, yeah, they can have tax exemptions on charity in their building, and that's it. Like, and I think you see a whole lot of problems going away. But nevertheless, I think you're right. I think this led religion to be able to be used as a hammer. And also in certain areas, I mentioned in southern Mexico, but I think we also need to look at the South. Southern religiosity after the Civil War really kicks up, and some of the most religious places, which are some of the most reactionary now, but were some of the most either abstentionist or pro-union in the South. So Kansas, West Virginia, those areas, Appalachia in general, as opposed to the Tidewater, and yet, what do we get? Like, what happens to all those areas? Those areas become super fucking reactionary. Appalachia may be the least so, but I think Appalachia just pretty much would like everyone to leave it the fuck alone.
Well, one of the factors I think here on this point is the way that religion has been used to construct national identity,
right?
Which is pretty heavy and precedes the business identity of America, which is mostly like doesn't start until Wilson.
Like, I would agree with that.
And there's the market revolution, but that's older. But like sales as this is like just, I was going to do a whole series on the history of sales as a professional organized thing. That doesn't start until Woodrow Wilson like went out and started saying that American salesmanship was like one of our main values, and organized these big conferences where he promoted the idea of sales. Anyway,
Yeah, I think we need to look at that, because one of the most you want to talk about an interesting nationalist force. That's when the Klan, the second Klan moved from a weird Southern separatist ex-general terror cell that was not actually super popular even in the South, to a mass national movement that is not pro-Confederate. I mean, it kind of is, but it's actually largely adopted by both Republicans and Democrats, from Harding, Wilson, all of them, as a national unity for America as a Protestant nation, a white Protestant nation, a consolidation of WASP identity. And at the national level, yeah, there's all the lynchings in the South, and we don't want to discount that. But at the national level, what the Klan kind of is a racist multi-level marketing scheme that is anti-Catholic and anti-Jewish.
Yeah. Oh man, we'll get to the Klan. We got to go over World War One, but
right.
But the Klan is like,
the Klan is wild when you realize what the second Klan is. It's like, what?
And they are poster children for, if you take all the logic to like its extreme that forms national identity in the United States, they're pretty damn effective as the poster child. But yeah, so let's go over World War One. I'm pretty sure you know way more about World War One than I do. But specifically when it comes to anti-communists, this is when you finally see like federal activity really kick up, because once communist and any kind of anti-militarist organization, including pacifism, which was seen as a threat to as soon as anything is considered a threat to the war effort, especially if you're an alien, if you're foreign, then they're going to start deporting you. And that was the power that the federal government had at that point.
Yeah, so you see these mass deportations. I think this is also when, is this or is it World War II when you really see like a lot of the upper Midwestern socialists jump ship to Canada? Is it? It may be World War II actually, but it's during the war. The suppression of the I mean, communism causes a whole breakdown in the United States left too.
Right, which is this period we're talking about, is the formation of the Communist Party and the Communist Labor Party.
So the Communist Party, the Communist Labor Party, the Socialist Party, they all split. There are still, I think there's still some socialist representative. I mean, there's still one socialist representative in government. What's his face?
Debs?
No.
Debs?
No, he's a contemporary of Debs. He's slightly to the right of him. Debs doesn't get in the government. Debs goes to prison.
That's right.
I can't remember his name at the moment.
I can't either.
And his wife joins the CPUSA. What's interesting about this time period is the anarchist movement, the populist movement, and the populist movement starts fading into conspiracy theories actually right before this, and it takes a very right-wing turn and then becomes irrelevant. The anarchist movement gets more or less unified. Actually, interesting. Like Debs' strategy is kind of fascinating to me because he's an electoral figure who is running on a social democratic platform that is also syndicalist. and
Yeah.
slightly council communist, and even so like Soviet in the old sense, not Soviet in the Bolshevik, but Soviet in workers' councils.
Right.
He has like a program that's basically like, we'll do reforms, but also our goal is to transfer all the ownership to the workers themselves.
So yeah. So Big Bill Hayward, right? The IWW. So this is all right. They start getting crushed. And so much of their
Debs moves
membership
into the CPU to the CPA at this point, right? When they start getting crushed.
Yes. The Socialist Party starts getting crushed, right? That was part of Debs moving over. And
it gets, I mean, I think people, I say it a lot, but people need to think about how bad it got crushed. It commands like a fifth of the vote. No socialist movement in America had I think it was several 100,000 people who were former members, but like that's still not huge.
No,
but it commanded a fifth of the fucking vote. Like it was probably the largest third party movement in the United States outside of maybe the Bull Moose movement.
These and the IWW is huge. Like these movements getting crushed is not like what we would think. Like if the DSA got crushed, no,
the DSA crushed itself. But yes,
but this is the people. You know, the anti-communists at this point. You still had like the American Legion and other vigilante groups were the ones busting up union meetings and like even murdering socialists and communists, and it was like,
I think people underestimate how bloody that shit was. Like even like union meetings were often armed because they had to be, right? Like, and I think we always think of the American Legion as where we keep the old reactionary military people and they don't do anything, they just play cribbage. And in certain parts of the United States, that's what they are now. But they were a quasi-paramilitary in the early 20th century.
Yeah, and like the Daughters or Sisters or whatever of Liberty, like you had like a bunch of different vigilante patriot groups that their sole like purpose almost was to basically attack Reds.
Right. And then you have in the 19 teens and 20s, actual fascist groups start to form, which are tolerated for a long time because they fight Reds. A famous one that's actually kind of written out of history are the Silver Shirts.
Who were the American version of the Italian fascists. Yep.
I mean, we know about the German American Bund, but they actually kind of aren't that important yet. But it's like the Silver Shirts, the MLM of the Klan, which one of the weird things about the Klan is when we think of the Klan, we think of the first and third Klan. The third Klan is our modern terrorist Klan. The first Klan is the former Confederate Klan. The second Klan is so weird because they do engage in vigilante actions. They do kill people. But they're mostly a weird ritual MLM. That really is the majority of what they do. Like,
and they weren't marginalized yet.
No, they weren't marginal at all. It was like
right.
They're like the racist Shriners is really what they are. Like because it's a secret society, but it's a secret society in the same way like the Masons are. Like,
like quasi secret. And then have you heard of the Hearst Press?
Yes.
So that was big at the time too. And okay. The other thing is Gompers and the AFL. And this is where we really see, I think, American labor and the Democratic Party define itself in how it's going to be up till now, even, which is Gompers getting into the head of the AFL, becoming more and more explicitly anti-communist, and siding, looking at any kind of class struggle as a threat to Republican values. Back to that again.
Right.
That if you talk about class and you talk about class division, class war, class struggle, you're breaking up the Union, right? You're breaking up Republican strength.
I mean, it is essentially, actually, I hate to say it, it's convergent to national unionism and fascism, where they incur like we will have unions. Workers are a valid part of the corporate whole, and they need to be represented, and their interests need to be made. I mean, people forget this was really not in. This wasn't so much true in Hitlerism, but it was very true in Italian fascism until the very end.
Yeah. Well, Hitlerism is a weird aberration in a lot of ways from other fascist movements.
Right. So they nationalize all these unions. And actually, weirdly, these unions stay nationalized in Italy even after the end of the fascist, because the communists do it too. But so you have this national union movement, and Gomperism, it's not the same, but it's like a parallel development to that. It is a way to de-radicalize the union movement by basically saying, workers have a place in the republic, and we should have a way to advocate for our interests and protect ourselves, but we don't have interest as a class except at work, and only kind of there.
Right.
I think people also need to remember that, like, Powderly in the Knights of Labor was also kind of a nationalist, and he was definitely was as radical as like the Knights of Labor could sometimes be. I mean, and they would do stuff. They would kill people, not just immigrants. They wouldn't strike. They would not strike. Like, they oppose striking. So, so this tradition was already part of the American labor movement, which was the idea is, yes, we need to advocate for interests against the boss, but we will not stop production.
Especially during a war.
Yeah, especially during a war. Unfortunately, everybody, including the CIO, eventually takes that tactic.
Yeah, we'll get to the CIO.
But yeah, that's World War II. So you have this, and Gompersism, the right in the SPA, who is alienated by communists and also doesn't want immigrants or black people to be in the union. When Debs is in prison, they become increasingly important, and a lot of the more radicals leave to a lot of different communist parties, which unfortunately, during the early periods, Zinoviev, one of my least favorite Bolsheviks, even if he was part of the left opposition, would play against each other. So you have all this strife. Eventually, though, the CPUSA emerges, and weirdly, it's mostly, I mean, people think, it was taking orders from Moscow.
This has always been a theme in anti-communism, is the foreign, whether it was immigrants causing insurrections that they were worried about, or if it was taking orders from Moscow. This has been the American version of anti-communism.
And what unfortunately does happen is there were times with the Comintern, when the third Comintern would act in America, and like people would disappear. Like, so a lot of people, if you wanted to find the people affected by that, those would be the people you would empower to lead the progressive end of the anti-communist movement. This was a strategy after World War I. It was perfected in the 40s and 50s.
Right.
But it was a strategy after World War I. You would always try to find someone who legitimately got wronged. Like, you tried to find people who really got wronged by something that happened in the communist or socialist movement. And you would want it to be real, so that when people looked into it, they go, oh, there is some sketchy shit going on there.
Yep.
There's always sketchy shit going on everywhere. But like, which is not an excuse for it, but it is something we have to look at. So you would have like somebody goes to the Comintern in the 20s and they disappear. Like, particularly in the late 20s. I do think this happened once. It is unknown. I think even the archives don't make it clear if this person just like just died abroad and was not recorded, or if he was arrested for opposing Stalin or whatever. But by and large, at the local level, particularly during Third Periodism, the fight between the First and Second International was so intense that Russia pretty much left the CPUSA to do whatever the fuck it wanted.
Yeah.
So in the 20s, what they do is they realize that the racial problem is huge, that they think that's the primary division. So they come up with basically the black belt thesis, which is we're going to encourage, a kind of black nationalism for former slave states to finish the promise of the Civil War. We're going to frame it like that, and we're going to take all these black and Jewish members who are shut out of this other stuff, and we're going to empower them as leaders. Unfortunately, in the long run, this actually puts tensions not just between Jews and Jews being communist and blacks being communist, but also puts the black and Jewish community at odds, which is a long story. But if you read like The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual, there's like 4 chapters on how like Jewish nationalists are manipulating the communists, and that's why we black nationalists need to leave. Like, that's in the 50s, but they're talking about stuff that's happening in the 20s and 30s. And so you have that issue going on. But because there is no popular front, and because the CIO is in competition with the AFL, and the CIO communist organizers are kind of good at their job, actually. They kind of replace they do actually replace what the Wobblies used to do.
Right.
In the teens, they kind of become that in the 20s.
Yeah, they took on the role of like accepting radicals and communists into their ranks, and which was used against him, of course.
Right.
But so the way that this period that we're talking about gets described is as 100% Americanism was kind of like the label for the ideology that was growing in the labor movement and outside the labor movement, to say that anything socialistic, communistic, and also fascist was not American. And then there was some of that popular frontist strategy by Democrats did sort of prevent Red Scare from becoming worse.
Right. Like, Derick, well, I think we need to look at the context of getting into World War II, because you have this, like, if you watch movies from the 20s and 30s, there's not many movies in the 20s anyway, but if you watch movies from the 30s, there's this weird silence on the anti-communism stuff.
Yeah.
From like 37 to about 45, which actually really fucks a lot of authors later, because a lot of them, A, were communist sympathetic, but B, they were also encouraged to be. And there is this weird way in which the Democrats have always been like, we will accept popular frontism. We know it's there, but the moment we can throw you under the bus as a distraction from us, and then deny we ever did anything in the first place, we're going to do it. Because, I mean, if you think about this, like, there are still Democrats today that will deny that there was like Soviet influence in the FDR administration, which I find that's ludicrous. Like,
I mean, the New Deal is such a big part of this history, but in a way, it's sort of like the beginning of Roosevelt's administration, in a lot of ways, prevented worse anti-communism from happening.
Right. And it does so, though. I think people, I mean, I know a lot of people, I know the DSA right now likes to like think of like the first democratic socialist FDR, which makes my stomach churn because I'm like, he was preventing it, but also capturing it. This is what's interesting. All sides of the American far left agree that the progressives are co-opting and defanging them. Like, it's not like the socialist movement agrees with that. The communists think that until 1936. Like, the CIO thinks it. A lot of people have nothing to do with European socialism, but are still kind of workers related. Think it like they don't trust the Roosevelt administration, and kind of for good reason.
Right. The totalitarian tendencies of it, because the federal government couldn't really do shit against anti-communists. The states could. Like, you had we didn't even mention the criminal syndicalist laws and all that stuff, which a lot of people were persecuted under.
I mean, in Georgia, to this day, to be a teacher, I have to take a pledge.
Yeah, the loyalty oath.
The loyalty oath, not that says that basically, I'm not a communist. I'm also not an Islamist. I'm not an anarchist. But if I was, then I will not overthrow the government of Georgia. Which is also interesting because what you notice there is Confederates would still be okay. So, like,
wow.
I mean, it's true though. That's what that oath says, that, you know, you have not advocated the overthrow of the government, particularly the government of the state of Georgia. I think it does mention the U.S. government now. So, like, diehard Confederates would probably be out, but that's never stopped anybody. And also, loyalty oaths don't work, except back then they could be used as an additional charge in court.
Yeah, and you see this more with like the FBI and, like, you know, later getting towards World War II stuff is where loyalty oaths become an effective, like, sort of like a canary in the coal mine way to identify radicals to be targeted for further suppression.
Right.
But just you mentioned the impact of you know, the Bolsheviks on communists in America, and we gotta separate two different periods. And the period that we need to look at is during the Hitler-Stalin Pact and after the Hitler-Stalin Pact. Because during it, the communists got screwed in America because they all of a sudden saw themselves being associated with the Nazis.
Which also, I mean, it also causes in the Northeast more than in the South, for reasons that are complicated that I could go into maybe, but it causes a whole lot of people to defect, like, out of the CPUSA, because I mean, like, it is one of those things. It's like, you did what? You cite, like, how do you justify siding with people who kill communists, whose platform is anti-communist, even more than the bourgeois, on tactical grounds? I mean, that's what breaks a lot of people's brain. And then in the popular imagination, you know, even though now we can talk about legitimately how much the Nazi laws are actually based on American laws after 1860, you know, and like the anti-Jewish laws are based on Jim Crow codes and stuff like that. That's totally true. But in the American mindset, in a way that actually surprised even the Nazis, we said they're scarier. We will even recruit former communists, as long as they're not Bolshevik communists, into the OSS to fight them. But the Hitler-Stalin Pact means that, you know, we're fucked. But there's also, though, there's another side to this that's interesting. Because of the Hitler-Stalin Pact, the black part of the CPUSA is actually freed from having to side with Gompersism and the Democrats until 1936. So they actually kind of develop an independent line and develop like, I mean, people don't like when I say this, but like even stuff like the black and folk culture art stuff come from communists in the fucking FDR administration, and that's specifically pushed by black ones. This really starts to, it allows for, I mean, I think it's historically, honestly, why there's like a lot of black communism in America, a lot of the black left does not have the same experience or ambiguity about like Stalinism that most of the rest of the left does, and that's because during this time period, during the height of high Stalinism, during third periodism, it's left alone. It's completely left alone and not told to subjugate itself into the Democratic Party. And unlike the right communist, everybody already hates them.
Yeah.
Like, so they're not losing anything by being associated with the Nazis the way that like the Jewish communists definitely fucking are. And a lot of the, you know, more educated liberal communists do. So you have this paradox where like it's a very bad period for communists in the Northeast. You see the growth of Trotskyist movements and this, that, and the other. But it's kind of a good period for the black left in America and for the Southern left, which is still super. I think people will sometimes think that this is huge. This is a super marginal movement.
But
like,
in the framework of anti-communism, though, this opens up a new way for communists to be attacked.
Right, and it is the Birch Society tactic to attack all civil rights leaders, even people like Booker T. Washington, who is a reactionary anti-racist, frankly, as somehow being secret communist. It's where that comes from. And it works.
Oh yeah.
It really works in the 50s. Like,
yeah, there's a whole book actually. I didn't get to read it in time for this, but it's all about the way that red baiting and the Red Scare targeted the civil rights movement. And there's a huge tie in there.
And it does that because because the CPUSA is more effective than the NAACP at actually getting the stuff done for black people in the South. But ironically, it's also because like it's really isolated and basically, you know, some people in Russia throw out agree with the black belt thesis, let it go, and kind of don't care. And I know when I say that, a lot of people who are more, you know, diehard Marxist Leninists get mad, but it's just true because it's inconsistent with what the CPs were doing in Europe. It totally is like almost the opposite strategy, where like the CPs in Europe get in the socialist and communist parties in Europe get totally fucked, except in France where they're part of the resistance, because like they, you know, like the bourgeois is oppressing them, but then they have these fascists who are really coming at them harder and killing them in the streets, and the CP's like, hold on, we'll get them later.
Well, so let's sort of like just talk about fascism for a minute too, because I did want to bring this up, and I know it's a little bit jerky to like say this now, right in the middle of what we were talking about, but I don't want to forget. Just the role anti-communism played in the formation of fascism and the ongoing rhetoric of fascist movements.
What I find fascinating about fascist movements, there's two books to read. I think it's like Fascism and there's a recent book by Brill, Fascism and Liberalism, or Liberalism. I can't remember the exact. It's like the Unguarded Spirit, something.
Oh yeah. I was looking at that actually.
Which is a kind of corrective to my favorite scholar in fascism, Sternhell, who I still think pretty much stands. I combine the two books now and say like, okay, fascism has a weird double appeal. It takes all these jaded communists who now see communism as an enemy.
Right.
I mean, Mussolini is like the standpoint example. Like Mussolini enters World War I as an accelerationist, literally hoping that the war will destroy the Italian state, and by the end of it, he becomes a rabid nationalist,
and a rabid Catholic,
right? Which
he wasn't to begin with.
No, he was not. He was, in fact, he was not the ultra left of the socialists, but he was pretty fucking close,
right?
And he flips. He totally flips. But he recruits a lot of people from the national liberation and proletarian nation end of the socialist movement. He also recruits a lot of people from the nationalist end of the syndicalist movement. So he takes a whole lot of like former anarchists who see like, okay, we need nations as our kind of adjudicating ways to get these syndicates to work. So they get included too.
Yep.
All right. But the one thing he does is like, look, this internationalism is a risk of our cohesion to be able to do the socialist project. It wants to destroy our nation. I know I used to believe it, more or less. Also, hey, we have this philosopher, Giovanni Gentile, who literally was praised by Lenin, but he agrees with us now because we need to build the state in an organic state in which all the classes can be made to fit because we're all stronger together.
Yes.
And so you have what is really as posited as socialist or socialist adjacent anti-communism.
Yeah, and this is like it's hard to describe what the difference is between hyper-nationalism and fascism until you start talking about the anti-communism, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Because when I look at this history, it seems to be at its core the same idea. And it plays out different historically depending on what socialists do. That's the way it seems to me.
Right, and I think also that shapes of whether or not your fascism is going to use its integralist base as national, religious, or racial. And
Yeah.
I hate to tell people, but the racial option is actually not the most commonly chose one.
Well, yeah, because you don't necessarily need it in a lot of European countries that were already very homogenous, right?
Right.
Or the nationalism of its earlier period of state formation already genocided culturally or in other ways various populations that it dominated.
I mean, Italy is a weird case here because the consolidation of the Italian state was actually really recent compared to a lot of the other attempts at fascist countries.
Yes.
But because when you look at like the oldest countries that have nation states, and it's really hard to explain this to Americans because Americans all think like European nations are all super old, and I'm like, no, they're not. Like, they're really not. Like, the only ones that are super old are Britain, the one you know about, France, the one you kind of know about, and Spain.
Yep.
And they're only 500 years old, meaning that they're only about 100 to 200 years off your colonial project, of which you separated 200 years later. So, like, I mean, New Spain and Spain happened at about the same time. And, you know, I tell the people they don't get it. I'm like, look, the Reconquista ends like 30 years before, like, they throw all those same soldiers at the New World. Like,
right, because I don't think people realize where the wealth came from to fund national states, right? The nation state, obviously the bourgeoisies of the different countries were able to accumulate enough wealth to fight the old order.
And they either did it through mercantile through investment, and that's England, mercantile empires, that's also England, or
Amsterdam.
Amsterdam. I think the weird. I mean, Germany's the weird one, and Germany is always the weird one. That's why communists have put so much hope in it, because it wasn't able to get its empire up and running in time, and its national consolidation project was late, which actually incentivized it to be super efficient. And the European socialists didn't think about the Americas fucking existing, really. Like,
No.
like Marx and Engels do during the Civil War. I will give them that. Like, they're writing letters all over the place in the Civil War. And there's also a sense in which, like, the Republican project has a whole lot of these First International and like not First International, excuse me, proto First International people from 1848 get the fuck out when they lose and go to the Americas, and they do make a core of like of the Republican Army.
And the 48ers are like some of the, you know, they are really a big part of the representation of socialism here being foreign.
Right. And that's when it initially is associated with Germans and Italians.
Yeah.
Then later it gets associated with Italians and Irish because they figure out, we assimilated the Germans. They're no longer, because they're Protestant and white. And they're white because, and I hate to tell people this, like you always talk about whiteness is a Christianity shaped hole. Like,
yeah. Because, yeah.
There's deep history that's beyond the scope of the day. I talk about it all the time, but like you don't. I really say this, like, European is not used as an adjective hardly at all until the fall of Byzantium.
It's Christendom,
and Christendom before that,
right? Like, because their enemies were the spread of Islam,
right? And that wasn't racial, so,
right?
So it's which is not to say that, like, people in the early Renaissance or late medieval people are racially woke. They just don't think on those terms.
It's a different paradigm.
Right. So that's all in our deep history, but that does lead to that's how we're able to cast all this as foreign. And we kind of ignore the American experiments that are happening indigenously in this stuff. We just pretend it doesn't happen. And even up and through the SPA, what they always hit those guys with is like, oh, there's so many German immigrants in your mess. Like, you're the children of these 1848ers, basically. You're still foreigners. And I think Debs becomes such a propaganda vehicle for the socialists because they couldn't hit him with that.
Oh, yeah.
And so, like,
I think that's pretty verified. Because he was able to survive all the, you know, basically the purges of the country of foreign socialism.
Right. And this is also, I mean, this also is why there's a couple of reasons why. And I think I have some friends who would tell me that I'm being unfair to the socialists about this, because they're like, they weren't anti-immigrant, they were anti-conscript labor. And I'm like, yeah, technically they may have worded it that way. And some of the people in the leadership may have really believed they were parsing that line. But the rank and file letters indicate, no, the people understood it to be anti-immigrant. That's despite whatever the fine point was. And part of that, though, was to stop the accusations that they were a foreign outside threat. Like, that was also part of the motivation.
Yep.
That I think to jump back to the time period we were talking about, fascism is interesting because basically the reason why it doesn't take off in America, and I know people are going to think I'm fucking Jonah Goldberg for saying this, but the right wing of progressivism had already taken that role in the United States.
And it seemed too German and it still seemed foreign to them.
Right.
And it didn't need it. It was also a very alien way of thinking.
Right. I mean, like, we didn't think of ourselves like blood and soil nationalism is a really late development in the United States. Like, late as in, like, I think it's really kind of a product of the last 40 years.
You have to forget history to embrace it.
Right. And actually, that was why, I hate to say it, but that was why whiteness wasn't like took off here. It didn't take off in Europe. Like, even though it comes from like France, racial taxonomy comes from apparently Sweden.
Yeah, the British fascists, like, I don't even think start caring about whiteness necessarily until much later. Like because they were just British.
Right. And when you read about like races in 19th century stuff, race and nation are used interchangeably. So people talk about like the German nation, by that they mean German culture. But they also talk about the German race.
That screws up everybody.
And everyone's like, what the fuck? But in America, and I almost want to say it ends up being a horrific monster machine, but the initial impetus is kind of progressive in that the idea is like, look, our belonging is so minimal that you basically can speak our language and just be the right fucking skin color. and later on, actually later, also be Protestant. That's not initially
Yeah.
a huge part of it, but
Well, it's what you said. It's a Christianity shaped hole, right? I
right.
mean, it's a lot of the whiteness stuff is trying to fill in that gap that's left after
You get rid of a
going to
state
the
religion.
yeah, or just indigenous origin at all.
Right. So you have a settler colonial project. You have no state religion. So you have nothing else. So you, like this actually, I think, is the reason why race is always a bigger deal in the Protestant settler colonial projects than in the Catholic ones. And why it's not that Catholics didn't have, like, have you seen a casta painting? They had 16. They had a racial categorization that kind of boggles our mind, actually, because like wait, blacks from this place are actually above whites from this place, but like if they intermarry, and we encourage intermarriage, but this will make this caste go up and this caste. What the fuck? like if you look at the caste, it's like there's like 36 flavors here. Like, and Americans are very much like there's white, there's black, there's red, and eventually there's yellow, although it's not really important in the beginning. And we have a very simple category, except in the Northeast, where the ethnic tensions really matter. And the project in the South is like, you just got to get everybody to be fucking white.
Yeah,
like that's the goal.
and
like,
then like the polish on that piece of turd is anti-communism.
Right. Anti-black and anti-blackness and anti-communism are tied together.
Yeah.
And until actually the 70s, which becomes a whole different problem. But like that's when that gets disassociated. But it's basically like the people think, and the Birch Society in particular, and that's later, but they really lean in on this, like, oh, well, the best activist for the civil rights in the 20s and 30s was the CPUSA. Look at W.E.B. Du Bois. And they were doing weird shit. I mean, I also have to forget, like, I love W.E.B. Du Bois. I think people should, like, memorize the souls of black folk for understanding, you know, the black experience in the South in the early 20th century.
Is he also the person that came up with the double consciousness?
Yes, he's double consciousness. He's the person who comes up with wages of whiteness. But he also, I mean, it's interesting how he's used now, because he's also talking about the wages of whiteness are social. Their social powers are kind of cultural capital, but they are still largely from economic incentives, which is what people shut out from his writings. But he also does stuff like during third periodism, he supports the Japanese because he thinks like it'll be a counter imperialism to Western imperialism. Ooh. And he doesn't know about what's going on in Manchuria. He just doesn't know. But it's also because of the Hitler-Stalin Pact. So and there are still a few black communists to this day who will defend that position, at least in that time period, which I find wild. But I think Gerald Horne wrote a book about this, trying to defend Imperial Japan, kind of, sort of. And this comes from this time period. So like, and I hate to say it, but a lot of communists today also don't want to dig into this because it makes us look wild. Because like because the communists see the Second International as one of the primary threats in Europe, it leads to all kinds of incoherence elsewhere. And there is a sense in which the American communists they're not answering the dictates of Moscow. There's been work that I used to actually believe they did, but like myself, but I've seen scholarship that pretty much proves that they were largely kind of independent after Zinoviev quit fucking with them. And that's kind of why it really takes the shock of the Hitler-Stalin Pact to really get anyone to be concerned, because one, they have kind of detente with liberals. There's a lot of liberals who kind of, I mean, liberals in the early 20th century are hard to peg, because you have the same people will write something positive about the Soviet Union in the late 20s will also be the same leaders of anti-communism even a few years later, not even like half a generation later. Like you're talking like between like 1927 and 1935.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
and like communists themselves don't know what to do with this. They don't really know who their allies are. And and I think it really affects the communists in the Northeast. It also doesn't help that the left opposition parties in the 30s and 40s are the people who really lead off labor strikes, like the general strike in what is it? Is it Chicago? Is it Chicago? That's led by a Trotskyist party who is not even, the Trotsky parties at this time just wants to join back into the CPUSA. They're not even trying to be a totally separate opposition yet. And you can see the communist papers going back and forth, and anti-communists seize on this shit because they actually follow what we do to find weakness, and they utilize it over and over again. And what throws, I think in this period, throws communists into a fucking tizzy is like, particularly after 1936, they're told to side to help the progressive bourgeoisie. The progressive bourgeoisie is seen as the party of FDR.
Yes.
But this really puts the CPUSA in a weird fucking position. You are told to enter at least a détente with the, like, you're not endorsing candidates, but you're not running your own, with the Democrats during the period in which they are explicitly the party of segregation, and yet your strongest membership in a lot of the areas that are run by Democrats are black people. What the fuck do you think is going to happen? And this also starts a long and time-tested strategy where the Communist Party from like the late 30s forwards starts doing shit like discouraging strikes, which have been a problem for the socialists, and like you see them like repeating mistakes that the socialists in Europe make. So they discourage strikes during wartime off of the Popular Front strategy.
Yeah, all the labor unions basically agreed on that too.
Right. So the radical labor union is just like, we're not going to do it. Never mind, it's like one of the times it would actually be effective, but the risk is seen as too strong. Kind of like actually labor unions didn't, like, the analogy actually is in the first year and a half of COVID, labor unions didn't do shit. We saw a major labor strike uptick last year and the beginnings of this year. Well, mostly last year actually, but what it actually was just a return to a normal level of striking. Striketober was just like a return to the average strike level for the year.
Yeah, exactly.
Which, you know, I can go off on why this kind of stuff maddens me, but so you see this, and so you have this weird dialectic going on. Anti-communists are coming at the communists from all directions. But communists really are like not doing anything to help themselves with this ammo because they keep on making tactical decisions that are like, what? Like,
and FDR's total effect, right, is that so he gets you know, on the one hand he's sort of easing things up because of popular frontism for radicals, communists. On the other hand, he's expanding state power, which is going to immediately boomerang back and bite communists in the ass. So it's almost like you can't think of a more perfect way to finally get the federal government to bring this to a higher level of contention, anti-communism. And so this is where all of the major Democrat versus Republican political party oriented anti-communism starts. Is the New Deal, right? That's when you finally see the Democratic Party get accused of having communist sympathies.
Right.
Because before then, the parties, maybe by some critics, but
there were communists who were willing to align with either party's progressive faction before the 30s.
Yeah, but after the New Deal is when you
Right.
you really see the Republican Party, and you really see anti-communism become part of electoral politics.
So what you have then is this like neoconservative really does come out of this. I think the tendency to blame it on Trotskyism is overstated, because it was there are neoconservatives from Maoist factions and stuff too. But what really leads this is the Skip-Jackson Democrats. It is the anti-communists trying to outflank.
Yeah.
And this really gets in high rhetoric during. I actually pointed out to somebody, and I got pushback for this. This is one of the few times where I got ratioed. Where I said, look, dipshits, this idea that FDR had a spur of the moment like awakening that his anti-communism was stupid, and was really, going to back off, and it was a deep state that killed them, that I see some communists flirting with, is actually the communist version of a Bircher conspiracy.
Yeah.
Where the Birchers say, no, the deep state can kill them because they're actually secretly communist sympathetic. And at the end of his life, FDR realized that international capital and globalism was actually a front for communism, and they killed him to get rid of that. It's the same fucking conspiracy.
Well, yeah, and they're saying that because of Hoover, right?
Right.
Because, no, I mean, there's you need to consider the other variables.
This is gonna probably I think I'm gonna have you come on in the future, maybe in 2 months, to talk about from the 40s forward, because it's already been 2 hours.
Oh, I know.
But but I could talk about anti-communism all day. But I think what we need to look at here, though, is this causes the current thing that we see now, and it's really hard to explain. Like, how is it that the party of segregation, which is the party of reaction in the South, I'm going to say this, until the late 1990s, all right? In the southern states, the Dixiecrats are still a major factor until a bunch of Republican governors are voted in the late 90s, and the House legislatures literally just changed their names from D to R. But that's only 20 to 25 years ago.
Right.
Like, so this party that has this element of it, and by the way, that element of it, even though, one of those presidents ends up being progressive in their post-presidency, Carter, is the part of the party that produces most of the presidents until Obama. All right. And that I include Lyndon Baines Johnson in that, even though he's a progressive. Is that the Southern element of the Democratic Party is the predominant element of that party also until the 90s. Count your Democratic presidents until Obama. Only one of them, after JFK, only one of them isn't Southern.
And and then with Obama, oh man. Yeah.
And Obama's a whole different problem. Like, Obama's like, when I point out that his white family is literally like from the same lineage as like the Bushes and the Adamses, and I'm like he comes from such white era. He comes from like his white family is aristocracy, like they're part of the old money elite in the United States. And when I say that, people it sounds like I'm a right-winger Bircher who's freaking out about like secret globalists, but I'm like, no, I need you to look at the class structure. The presidents who weren't part of that elite were JFK, who's part of a different elite, but
Yeah,
was later.
and,
Reagan, Clinton,
yeah,
Trump. And not, which is not, and no way am I implying, Carter, I forgot Carter. But in no way am I implying that these people are not elites. They're just not from,
it's a different.
yeah, they're not from the old money, old money families, which is something that America has, and we just don't like looking at.
Yeah, and I think people are starting to realize that a little bit more, but
I actually think one of my theories that I'm like, you know why everyone's pissed off about Trump, right? Like, yes, he's a reactionary shitbag, but like they're really mad that he's not a genteel old money reactionary shitbag. Like, and at least Reagan could put on a good act. And the Democrats, we can allow them to have their thing every now and then so that people think that they actually matter. But like, but I sometimes think that actually is the animus of some of what we see here. I think we could safely say Biden's not part of that elite either. But we are now, I think that period may be over in American history, actually. But to go back to this time period you're talking about, because I'm American history gets me rambling. What we see here, though, we have to look at the class, and this is how it's related. We have to look at the class that FDR comes from. The Roosevelts are part of the old money Northeastern Brahmin aristocracy. They were running out of money before this time period, and so concessions feel easier for them to make. And one of the things that the reactionaries were always able to throw at them is that, well, you're trying to, one of the things that you would hear from like Birchers is they're trying to suppress the new money elite and the commodity producers and these, and so like they've sold out to the communists to maintain their aristocratic status, which I hate to tell people is in the DNA of even some current anti-left rhetoric from former leftists to this day. And it doesn't help that in some ways it's not even false. Like, they're not selling us out to the communists, but this is this way in which they're like, we're going to co-opt all these social movements and maintain a base of our power and actually stabilize capitalism, and thus our national identity, because our national identity is tied into that. By co-opting parts of it, making it safer, making it impossible to fully achieve what it wants, but giving them something, because if we don't give them something, we now have a state, or two states actually, outside of the United States that will give them aid.
I think so. Look, from the other angle, a way to say this is what the Republicans, they're always referring to Jefferson, right?
Mm-hmm.
But really, I mean, it's after Jefferson when you really start getting like business as the foundation for capital, right?
Right. I mean, honestly, unfortunately, you have to look. It really is the party of Lincoln, and is also that's also why communists like Lincoln, because Lincoln is a progressive capitalist, because he's in a period in which capitalism would have actually been seen as progressive. Like, that's I think that's Marx and Engels' logic on it, because like Lincoln is a radical egalitarian in some ways compared to, like, he wants to get rid of this planter class. He is a racist, but he's such a mild one compared to everybody else. Like, he does think black people are people, which is a step forward. And because we're talking about a time period where, like, well, people are pushing curse of Ham and like using a mixture of biblical and like weird biogenic theories, be like they're not even the same species as us.
Yeah. but like, back to the economic schism there, it's the landed money versus the business money.
Right. It's landed. It is literally yeoman capital, yeoman proto capital versus industrial capital.
Yes.
And then also this planter aristocracy. And I think
Yes.
because the South is so poor now, and so many people during the planter aristocracy were poor, the vast majority of the South was poor.
But it was heavily stratified, right?
Right. But the
inequality
wealth
there was-
concentration in the South was insane.
Yeah.
Like these massive super plantations that you can go see in like Savannah, they don't come from nothing, folks. You have to take that from somebody. Like,
well, and the way that land is owned is different. I mean, just like the quantities of land by how many entities is different in those regions because of that aristocratic origin.
And even that maintains actually when the South is brought into the Union. And one of the reasons why keeping the South poor was considered so important. And I always point this out, like the South wasn't allowed to fully industrialize until, and it literally by economic policy was discouraged from fully industrializing because they were afraid that it might rise up again until the 1920s. And what did they build there? Fucking textile mills. And
right.
I don't mean to tell you, like, textile mills are the first form of capital, but they're also the shittiest form of capital. Wherever there are textile mills, there's rampant fucking poverty. Like, that's been true for 300 years. So, like, so what you see in the South, you see textile and agriculture. They don't start moving industrial shit down there actually until all the unions are broken. And that's still true. Like the reason why like more and more factories get built in the South now is like there's no union base for them. You don't they never were incorporated in the state infrastructure. And a lot of those states, public sector unions have been outright illegal since the 40s. So they don't have like municipal unions. And I mean, I know I come from Georgia, like unions are not illegal there, but public sector unions are. You can have associations, but they cannot strike by
and that
law.
comes out of this World War II period as well, where they went after they got rid of they were able to attack public sector unions in that way.
Right. And what I think is fascinating, and I used to be really bitter at the AFL-CIO because they just let it happen. Like they didn't fight it at all. And that was partly because after the Labor Relations Board is established, they didn't feel like solidarity strikes are outright illegal. And so like they don't feel like they can do anything about it. Like, so they're like, okay, we'll try to do private sector union stuff in the South. We won't really fight. We won't try to get the teachers unions and all this other stuff. I mean, it also means like the Fraternal Order of Police can't strike in the South either, although they think they still kind of exist. But like in Georgia, there are two teachers associations. Neither one of them are unions. And like even out here in Utah, right, which is it's a right to work state. And I always like right to work doesn't stop you from striking.
Yeah, Arizona too.
Yes, you could fire us all if you can replace us, which you can't. But whatever, people can internalize that the way they want to. But unfortunately, what had happened and what's continued to happen since the 50s is because of anti-communism and even being seen as too progressive has led a lot of unions in this area. This is not universal to all unions in the United States. I get people who think I'm saying that I'm not. To develop very conservative strategies for survival, to become very anti-strike, even within the confines of the law, and to basically be seen by a lot of teachers as a second or third wave of management that at best can provide you liability insurance. And that's been completely damning. And that goes back to this period. Although even out here, one of the most militant teacher strikes in the United States history happened in Utah in like 82. So like in Utah in 82, those are not liberal people. I want to add that too. Like these are not good liberal Democrats in 1982 in fucking Utah. Like, but they were labor militants. And this is another thing that leads to like the stupid "what's the matter with Kansas" problem. Because anti-communism seems successful, and then you hear all these like liberals saying, well, these people are voting against their interest. And it's this time period, I'm like, are they voting against their interest? Because you have fucked over their labor movement over and over and over again in the name of anti-communism, going back to the fucking 40s. Like, look at, like, Harry Wallace was a mess, but like when Harry Wallace gets booted out as, and you get Truman instead of Wallace as the successor.
Yep.
That's the end of the left progressive alliance, really.
Right.
But no one realizes that until the purges in the 50s.
Right.
Like,
oh, and that, well, yeah, we're gonna have to just get into that all.
Yeah,
later,
we need to talk about.
Was
another 2 hours on this because
such a tool.
like, because this shit really amps up in the late 40s and early 50s, but you do see, and we haven't even gotten to like the Birch Society. We haven't really covered the late period of the Second Klan. But it's hard to cover all this because as you and I were talking about this, we were like, I want to talk about anti-communism. I love talking about anti-communism. We both realized, like, man, that's like most of American history. Actually,
yeah.
like you can't talk about anything in the U.S.
in one
history
way or another. It implicates just about every major,
including the fucking communist. Because I mean, we don't even like. We as a unified movement, I don't mean like Marxist or whatever, just using communist as a blanket program for anyone who is an anti-capitalist, relative egalitarian. Like,
yeah, okay. Small c
communist, small e egalitarian even. But like all those people, we're even implicated in this because of the ways we infight, because of the ways we misunderstand what's going on. We constantly make missteps, and like we contribute to our own oppression over and over again.
Yeah.
I mean, and I think we're about to live through another period of it.
Like, no, we are, and this is like why I'm so like hot on this topic. I see the same missteps. Why are we talking about Mondragon so much? That's already like we're just reinforcing the foreignness of socialism again. Like,
and also like we also don't portray it in an accurate manner anyway. But like,
right, like as Catholic or like the way that it has not consistently been
it had to hire outside management, even though it was co-ops, and yes, the co-ops run this way, but Richard Roof isn't telling you the whole story. Listen to Mike or Albert, even though I find his answer to it like totally frustrating. But like, at least Albert's right about this. Like, they start adapting, the co-ops start adapting exploitive capitalist practices for people outside of the co-op, etc. and so forth. Like, yes, it's a better quasi-capitalist system than ours. Yeah, I mean, co-ops are always preferable to the shit we deal with now because you have more agency and involvement into the system. And that actually does, for a while, even build a better business. It definitely builds better working conditions, but it doesn't forever because the profit pressures are real.
Yeah. But I mean, it's just like you could still say what you want by looking at American co-ops. You don't have to talk about this big elephant Mondragon.
Right? Why do we always talk about campism? Why are we so attracted to I mean, particularly now? Like, I'm like, are we talking about campism without ideology at all?
What do you mean campism?
So we're always picking some country somewhere else to like critical support against ourselves or whatever. And I'm like, I call this the Chomsky problem as understood by a dog. So like you hear like you should focus on your own issues at home because that's where you have the most effect. And I'm like, yes, that's true, but it's also kind of anti-internationalist if you take it too far, and it can lead to you being idiotic and just like trust, like either accepting the propaganda of your own country or accepting the propaganda of someone else's country as truth when really everybody involved has incentives to be fucking lying to you.
Yeah.
And what's funny is, like, if you meet people from highly authoritarian, if you meet workers from highly authoritarian regimes, they are cynical about everybody, right? And they have fucking good reason to. And actually, the average American is too. It's like ideologically motivated leftists who tend not to be. I mean,
That's
like,
true. Yeah.
I remember just when I remember as a young idiot when I was canvassing for Gravel, and then ended up canvassing for Barack Obama, and just going and talking to black men and like the projects and in trailer parks in the South, and to poor white men in the projects and the trailer parks in the South. About half of them of both races could not vote because they were felons,
Right.
usually for drug crimes.
Yep.
But beyond that, there was a very much a fuck all y'all attitude, and like, we might vote for whoever is more popular, and that's pretty much it. Like,
yeah, that's, I mean, we both have similar like countercultural roots too with the punk scene, but that was very prevalent.
Yeah, well,
And-
amongst working class butter punks, it's like no one trusts
Yeah.
anybody. And I
Right.
remember actually when I talked to millennial leftists, I'm like, you people believe in government institutions in a way that I just don't.
Oh, it's
Like-
amazing. Yeah.
Like, I'm just like, have you worked for one, or have you just been in school most of your life? Which it sounds super dismissive, but I'm like, there, a lot of these people have this inherent tendency to like bureaucratize, and I'm like, no, systematizing things good. Bureaucratizing things looks like systematizing things, but it's actually terrible. Like,
Yeah, that's an interesting distinction.
Yeah, it's something I really think about, and unfortunately, I was talking to someone about this morning. Like, corporate management understands this better than leftists and uses it internal to levels of its, like, they encourage relative equality amongst teams, and as long as they're in the team, and this, that, and the other, because they realize that bureaucracy causes cost disease, and also the hoarding of skills, and eventually will lead to hyper fragile systems.
I mean,
they know this.
Because yeah, we could go on about that because
Yeah,
that goes back to World War II as well with information
it totally
theory.
does. And ironically, you know, anti-communism again, anti-communism is why we don't know the history of this stuff, because like information theory really does come from dissident Soviets who are purged who are shut out kind of in the mid to late 20s and are purged in the 30s. Their ideas are flirted with and then rejected in the early 50s by Khrushchev, who decides ultimately to go back to like basic Gosplan planning.
What is that podcast? Something unit, General Intellectual.
General Intellectual Unit.
They get into this stuff a lot,
right? And then corporate speak gets it, and then this one weirdo countercultural corporate designer takes it to Chile and does wonders with it, but they don't do it to the military, and they don't arm the populace, so they get fucking plowed in a way that should be obvious, because you've gotten rid of most of your other authority structures, but the military is not only authority structure that you didn't reduce, you didn't empower soldiers with, it's also an authority structure with guns, you dumbass.
You know what's funny too about this is that it's not just, you know, like the new capitalist propaganda, by that I mean like Libertarian Party,
right,
is basically a communications theory.
Yeah.
They're replacing the word communication with the word market, and they're talking about communications theory.
Right. Well, I mean, that's the whole thing. That's their whole switch, is to say market is an epistemic form of information.
Yeah.
Then they throw that out. And then I realized, like, oh shit, they're basically trying to use cybernetic theory, but ignoring that markets are inherently, they have an inherent tendency to be embedded in other systems, and also that they centralize over time, and so all the competitive structures they're talking about actually go away. Like, and it's weird because even early capitalists, like the classical economists and the neoclassical ones, knew that. They all knew it. And they were
Smith,
afraid of it.
right? Yeah, they knew that.
Like they were. I mean, Smith's big fear was that the centralization of wealth and the decline of profits would lead to rent seeking again, and that capitalism would devolve back into a feudal, not a neo-feudal for him, economy. That's what his fear was. Like it's funny because I'm like, I mean, Chomsky will occasionally get on this, like, you should read Smith. He would have been considered a leftist. I'm like,
Oh yeah,
that's not totally true, Chomsky, but he is concerned about rent-seeking power relations, but he also kind of thinks capitalism is maybe doomed. Like, because he also thinks, because the logic of LBT and competition means that profit rates will decline over time. And in real commodities, they do.
Yes. And he also, in his later, the moral sentiments, what clearly did not have the values that laissez-faire capitalists promoted. So, yeah,
I mean, I wouldn't say it was a leftist either, but yes,
no, but
yeah.
But that wasn't his project. His project was to deal with imports and exports, and how that was getting screwed up for the wealth of nations. Key word.
Right. And he's concerned about imports and exports, declining rates of profits, and he's trying to argue against like physiocrats and other and other theories that are other capitalist theories. And it's funny because I do think also, I think our understanding of all this is totally tainted by anti-communism in a very real way. Like, we don't even understand the origins and the original thinkers of early capitalism, which they weren't people writing manifestos. They were people trying to describe what was going on around
liberalism.
Yeah, we don't even understand liberalism. And in America, we particularly don't. Yeah. Because we both associate it with the left, but then we have this classical liberal idea, which we like, but they weren't corrupted by this dirty leftism. And I'm like, dude, the earth, like, all this communist shit has its origins. It really does have its origins in the bourgeois revolutions at the time, and they knew it.
Right.
Like that's what they were afraid of.
And America does, this is definitely another topic, because America does have its own liberal tradition that was developed in the early universities.
Right.
And not the same as France, not the same as Montesquieu.
No, I would actually say one of the things that Christopher Lasch points out, that the American liberal tradition and its radical inclinations actually does come out of a class of people that doesn't really exist in Europe.
Yeah.
Which is a group of people who are not productive bourgeois, but are also not aristocrats. Mm-hmm. They are like, they are the descendants of bourgeois, usually are of other inherited wealth. They may come from aristocratic families in Europe and just brought it here.
Yeah.
And they are the core of the thinkers of American liberalism going back to the 1890s.
Yeah. And like, where was Jefferson when the Constitution was being written? Not in America.
Well, yeah. Plus our own left is like hanging out in France, and
yeah. So they had access to all this university back then, privilege, and they were a very different group of people for sure.
Right. So our entire liberal tradition has this weird mixture of like yeoman proto-capitalism and also aristocracy, even though they were not formal aristocrats. Right. And that confuses a whole lot of the way we view all this stuff. And like, I think we can't narrate our own history to ourselves. Like, the American left is far more fucking interested, and for some good reason, but even in ways that don't make sense to me. Like, okay, why can I get people to study Russia and not shut the fuck up about Russia? And like, look, I think the Bolshevik Revolution is world historically important. I think the failure of the Soviet Union is a world historic tragedy, even though I think the failure of the Soviet Union is kind of the Soviet Union's own fault. But why don't we look at, I don't know, the Mexican Revolution, like the movements that the Haitian Revolution, like I taught a class at a charter school, oddly, to a bunch of kids where we were supposed to teach world governments and world revolutions. I taught the American Revolution, and then I also taught the Haitian Revolution, both Mexican revolutions, and the Bolivarian revolutions, and then the Civil War, and nobody had heard of that shit, like, at all.
I blame the
Including the other
academics,
history
Varn.
teachers.
I blame the academics.
Well, I think that's a large part of it. I think also that the university is itself, its largesse, and even the left march through it, was a product of the Cold War. And we underestimate that's effect. And maybe that's where we pick up next time, because that happens in the time period we're talking about.
All right.
Have a good night.
You too. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Out with